Very good morning. Thank you very much.
Do you want to raise it? Let's put it a little higher. The seat. Raise it a little bit.
Cheap.
Yeah. There we go.
All right, good morning. Welcome to this New Year's press conference in early February. Before the Secretary General starts, just to note that we have our excellent interpreters, both French, English, and Spanish in the back. So, and Arabic. No, we don't know.
So that means you are complaining.
Yes, exactly. Let's start first. All right, Secretary General has some opening remarks.
Maybe this is something you need to look at seriously.
And we'll then have about 45 minutes total. So, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, 2020 marks a milestone for the United Nations, our 75th anniversary. Too often, governments and international institutions are viewed as places that talk, not as places that listen. And I want the United Nations in this anniversary essentially to listen. And so we are making it based on conversations in every corner of the world about the future we want and the United Nations we need. And there is no doubt that people have much to say. The disquiet in streets and squares across the world is proof that people want to be heard. They want world leaders to answer their anxieties with effective action. That means addressing cascading challenges and breaking what I call the vicious circles that define our day. One such vicious circle is in the realm of peace and security, making conflicts longer, more lethal, and more likely to erupt in the first place. Tensions were, of course, high as the last year ended, but we were moving in the right direction in a number of hotspots. We were seeing signs of de-escalation and some measure of progress. That's all changed. I've spoken recently about winds of hope, but today a wind of madness is sweeping the globe. From Libya to Yemen to Syria and beyond, escalation is back. Arms are flowing and offensives are increasing. All situations are different, but there is a feeling of growing instability and hair-trigger tensions, which makes everything far more unpredictable and uncontrollable, with a heightened risk of miscalculation. Meanwhile, Security Council resolutions are being disrespected even before the ink is dry. As we can see, problems feed each other. As economies falter, poverty remains entrenched. As future prospects look bleak, populist and ethnic nationalist narratives gain appeal. As instability rises, investment dries up and development cycles down. When armed conflicts persist, societies reach perilous tipping points. And as governments grow weak, terrorists get stronger, seizing on the victims. In the year ahead, I will press to break this vicious circle of suffering and conflict and to push for a strong surge of diplomacy for peace. I would like to announce today that I will be attending the African Union Summit this coming weekend in Addis Ababa. And the African Union is one of UN's leading strategic partners, and I look forward to discussing the continent's efforts to silence the guns, as well as our shared work to address the full range of global challenges. Another clear vicious circle is exacerbating the climate crisis. As oceans warm, ice melts, and we lose the vital service the ice sheets perform, reflecting sunlight, thus further increasing ocean warming. And as ice melts and the oceans warm, sea levels rise and more water evaporates, fueling ever greater rainfall, threatening coastal cities and deltas. Last year, ocean heat and mean sea level reached their highest on record. Scientists tell us that ocean temperatures are now rising at the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs a second, and ecosystems are suffering the fallout. A recent study found that ocean heat in 2019 was 228 zetajoules above the 198 2010 average. Now, zeta is a quantity that we have difficulties to imagine because, I mean, we know 1,000 is 1 plus 3 zeros, a million 1 plus 6 zeros, but when we come to zeta is 1 plus 21 zeros. So we are 228 zetajoules. Joules is the unit above the average between 1981 and 2020. And this shows how quick warming is taking place in the oceans. To put that in context, this rise in ocean heat last year is more than 20 times the amount of energy humanity has consumed since 2000. Meanwhile, as permafrost disappears and the Strunda thaws earlier and freezes later, vast amounts of methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, enter the atmosphere, accelerating global warming. And as forests burn, the world loses vital carbon sinks and emissions skyrocket. The smoke from Australia's fires is now itself a literal vicious circle, circling the globe and releasing the equivalent of as much as 6 months of the country's total carbon emissions in 2018. What happens in Australia doesn't stay in Australia, and the same can be said about any part of the world. A new climate crisis alert by the World Meteorological Organization that today indicates that CO2 concentrations will reach new highs by 2020. The challenge for this year's climate conference in Glasgow, COP26, is clear. All countries must show more ambition on adaptation, mitigation, and finance. And the big emitters must lead the way. We need a price on carbon and an end to subsidies to fossil fuels. And we are still seeing too many plans for coal plants. The addiction to coal remains dangerously strong. There is some good news. Awareness of the risks is growing. Announcements of climate action by governments and the private sector are gathering steam. Investments are increasing. Minds are changing. And this year's conference on oceans, sustainable transport and biodiversity are further opportunities for action. But we need to keep up the pressure to break the vicious circle that is propelling both humankind and the natural world to the point of no return. Now is also the time to break the vicious circle of poverty and inequality and to shape a fair globalization leaving no one behind. The Sustainable Development Goals are, as you know, our blueprint, and development is a goal in its own, but it's also our best form of prevention. And we have just launched a decade for action to deliver the goals, a great global mobilization. Finance, of course, will be critical. We know that the progress on one goal can generate progress on all. The virtuous circle we know is possible, and that can point the way towards growth and prosperity for all. This is crucial across all fronts, including education, gender, equality, health, and working together to confront new challenges, such as the outbreak of the coronavirus we are facing now. As we can see from the challenges I've outlined today, multilateral institutions are needed more than ever and must be turned to the challenges of the 21st century. I will continue my efforts to build both a networked multilateralism, with the United Nations and all international organizations working together, and an inclusive multilateralism, able to listen and incorporate the contributions of businesses, civil society, local and regional authorities, and young people. Despite often deep divisions among member states, I am determined to keep listening to people, to speaking out for reason, holding fast to principles, and guide myself and the UN by the mission and values of the Charter. That is how we will break the vicious circles and deliver for people, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary General, for this press conference. We hope that to see you very often in this room in 2020. My question is on Libya. After the 5+5 meeting in Geneva, the UN announced the agreement on a permanent ceasefire. Is the truce really holding, or outbreaks still remain? And which guarantees have the UN had from the Russians on Haftar compliance? Thank you.
I must say I'm deeply frustrated with what's happening in Libya. And I think that what's happening is a scandal. We had a number of countries coming together in Berlin where they committed not to interfere in the Libyan process, and they committed not to send weapons or to participate on any way in the fighting. Now, the truth is that the Security Council embargo remains violated. We still see planes coming both to Misrata and to Benghazi. We haven't seen any relevant stop in the respect or the disrespect of the arms embargo. And the truce that has lasted for a few days has been dramatically violated, and we have seen offensives and military operations of different sorts. The only good news is that it was possible to have a meeting in Geneva of the 5 military indicated by the GNA and the 5 military indicated by the LNA. The meeting started yesterday. Qassam Salami is shuttling between the two, and we hope that these will be able to produce some result. The objective is, of course, to move from a truce to a ceasefire and then to move on in relation to the other different objectives. We are still hoping that it will be possible to meet this forum with representatives of the House of Representatives and of the High Council of the Tripoli side. But let's be clear, what we are witnessing is absolutely unacceptable. We are seeing more and more civilians being targeted. We have seen migrants in a desperate situation. And all the commitments that were made, apparently, were made without a true intention of respecting them.
Edie?
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. And as Valeria said, we like to see you as often as possible. There's been criticism of the United Nations for not naming those responsible for violating arms embargo, for not naming mercenaries involved in Libya, or those responsible for the bombing of the Tajura detention center in Libya. How do you respond to that, and how can the world really go and try and stop this if the violators and those responsible aren't identified?
Well, I think they have been quite clearly identified in different occasions, and namely by Qassam Salame, that has spoken very clearly about the action of the different countries in the area, and the situation remains exactly the same. We haven't seen any improvement in that. And as I said, Qassam Salame has been quite outspoken in relation to that and quite clear in relation to those countries involved. And so I don't think that this criticism is fair.
Bitul?
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Beytül Yürük from the Turkish news agency Anadolu. From Anadolu, Turkish news agency.
Turkish.
Yes. What we're seeing in Idlib now does not look any different from what we saw in Aleppo and East Ghouta with displacements and bombings. And recently, we have seen a direct confrontation between the Turkish troops and the Syrian troops, resulting in casualties on both sides. I wanted to ask you whether the president of Syria, President Assad, has won a military victory, and what your message would be. President Assad won a military victory in Syria, and what your message is to the Syrian government and particularly to Russia and Turkey.
Now, we have been very clear, expressing our enormous concern with the escalation that we have witnessed in Idlib and asking for a cessation of hostilities. And we don't believe there is a military solution for the conflict in Syria. We have said it time and time again, that the solution is political and that the process needs to move on through the Geneva talks and then through the different steps related to it. As you mentioned, we are particularly worried that now the escalation came into a situation in which we had Turkish army and Syrian army bombing each other. And that, of course, is a change in the nature of the conflict that is extremely worrying. One reason more for the cessation of hostilities before the escalation comes to a situation that then becomes totally out of control. My strong appeal is for a cessation of hostilities, and my strong appeal, again, is for all the conditions for humanitarian aid to be created, the humanitarian aid to be distributed, to be created, as we are seeing now about, I think, 500,000 people already displaced by the recent offensive, and the very dramatic humanitarian needs related to it.
Sherwin, South African.
Hi, Secretary General. Do your wind of madness that is sweeping the globe, does that extend to the Trump peace plan on the Middle East? Given that it is in conflict with various UN Security Council General Assembly resolutions, whether on the 1967 borders, return of refugees, East Jerusalem and settlements. So given the 3-year build-up that we've had to this announcement and its failure to excite at least one party to this conflict, what would you like to see next? What do you believe are the realistic next steps that need to happen now?
Well, we don't consider it to be a meteorological question. Our position is very clear. We are the guardians of the UN resolutions and of international law in relation to the Palestinian question. We are totally committed to the two-state solution, and we are totally committed to support Israelis and the Palestinians to come to a peace process with a two-state solution based on international law, based on Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, and based on the borders of 67. So it is very clear what we believe in, it is very clear what we defend, and we have not changed our position.
Richard Roth.
Mr. Secretary, CNN, can you please name the countries and governments responsible for the failure to prevent the climate change situation from improving?
Well, I would say that probably we will have to consider most of the countries in the world. We have witnessed in 2019 an increase of emissions everywhere, or almost everywhere. We have witnessed that many countries did not respect the commitments made in relation to
Well, you said the big emitters
in Paris.
in your remarks. Who are the big emitters?
In Paris. And obviously, the central question now, after the decision that was taken here by 70 countries, that they would respect the objective of carbon neutrality, is to make sure that carbon neutrality in 2050 is accepted, namely by the big emitters. Who are the big emitters? Let's be clear. I mean, the big emitters are well known. The European Union, that has affirmed its commitment to it, the United States, China, India, Japan, probably Russia, these are the most important ones. It's absolutely vital that these countries, the countries I mentioned, respect also and assume until we get to Glasgow the commitment to be carbon neutral in 2050. Because carbon neutrality in 2050 is the way to guarantee that we will be below will be at 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. Now, the G20 countries represent 80% of the emissions, and so obviously, if it is extremely important that small countries have a very determined mitigation strategy, we absolutely need the big emitters to correspond, because if the big emitters do not correspond, our efforts will be completely undermined.
Talal?
Thank you very much. On Yemen, are we going to see any possibility of holding direct negotiations? Where do we go from here after the death of the Stockholm Agreement, which hasn't been implemented at all? And on Iraq, what's your comment about imposing a prime minister that the Iraqi people do not want? We have hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million of Iraqis demonstrating in the street yesterday and today. And I may add, the United Nations was a little bit hasty in welcoming that appointment.
So first of all, in relation to Yemen, I don't consider the Odeida agreement dead. I consider it in intensive care and very serious situation. But I mean, the process is not interrupted. The monitoring is still there. There is a ceasefire that is more or less respected, with, of course, difficulties. But this is just one aspect. I was very encouraged to see the de-escalation that recently took place, namely with the Houthis stop attacking Saudi Arabia, and with Saudi Arabia considerably limiting its military actions. As I was following also with interest the negotiations for a political solution in relation to the south. Unfortunately, and this is one of the things I've mentioned, we have witnessed in the last few days a new escalation in the conflict in Yemen. We are doing everything we can for this escalation to be reversed, and everything we can to create the conditions for a true political dialogue to be re-established. There was one good thing that I would like to underline. It was the permission for a first evacuation, even if a limited number, of people with health problems from the airport of Sana'a. And this is a positive signal. And I can tell you that we have been, both Martin Griffith and myself, very active in contacting all directly or indirectly involved to make sure that we reestablish the environment that was, I mean, clearly positively developing in the end of last year. And I mentioned that in the end of last year we had some indications in several conflicts that things would be moving positively, and we must do everything possible to reverse these recent problems and to come back to a more positive attitude. In relation to Iraq, we have been very clear that the demonstrators must be fully respected, that their human rights must be fully respected. We have been very active in saying that situations in which demonstrators are killed and things of sorts are unacceptable. I think that our special representative was correct in the sense that it was important for the government to take initiative, or for the president to take initiative to solve the political crisis. But of course, at the same time, we have been insisting on the need to create the conditions for people to demonstrate freely and for their voices to be heard.
Celia?
Celia Mendoza, Voice of America. Secretary General, what's your perception of the role of the United Nations and your role in particular in the situation in Venezuela? It's been more than a year that Juan Guaido took this parallel presidency. We have seen clashes. We have seen denounced from one side to the other. Maduro said that he wants the United Nations to oversee the process of parliamentary elections, upcoming elections. Do you think that's possible? Today, just the OAS, which is the regional organization in charge, tried to send a commission to verify human rights violations, and they were denied the entrance. And then the second part is you talked about this instability in the region. Bolivia has elections coming up. Evo Morales wants to be in the Senate election. And your representative, Mr. Arnaud, sent a message that was very clear about not polarizing the country within that. What's your vision in sense of what's happening?
Well, in relation to Venezuela, it is clear that the capacity of the UN to address the political problem has been limited. Our good offices can only work when both sides want the good offices to work, and until now we had not that situation. We have supported the Norwegian mediation. Unfortunately, it had not yet produced results, and we are, of course, very worried with the fact that the situation remains without a political solution. And we believe in a political solution based on dialogue. It's the only way to overcome these difficulties. On the other hand, we have been quite active in relation to two aspects. One, in relation to humanitarian aid, both to the Venezuelans that left the country and supporting the host countries that are under enormous pressure, as you can imagine, with the number of people that left, and also improving the humanitarian aid inside the country with the limitations that exist for the funding reasons, but with a very clear respect for humanitarian principles and to make sure that there is no discrimination in the way we operate inside the country. And finally, the Human Rights High Commissioner, with my full support, was, as you know, very active in the visit, has been very active in relation to the situation. There is an office now there. And so this is an area where we intend to go on helping as much as possible the reestablishment of a situation of normality in relation to human rights. But what is important, what remains important, is the political situation. In relation to Bolivia, you said what I can answer you. I mean, we appointed, as I know, a special envoy. Our special envoy has been very active with the only own objective to avoid or to help avoid that Bolivia becomes polarized and enters into a conflict that would be terrible for the people and for the future of the country, and to create conditions for the reestablishment of a normal democratic process with normal elections to take place in the country, and avoiding the kind of confrontation that would be a disaster for the country.
James?
James Bays, Al Jazeera. A follow-up question to your comments about Security Council resolutions being breached. Earlier on, you said those countries had clearly been identified, but they've not been identified by you. For your words to have real teeth, and with your moral authority as Secretary General, do you not need to name these names? And I ask you now whether you'd like to name the names of the countries that are breaching the arms embargo on Libya, and for that matter to call out the member of the Security Council, the permanent member, that is bombing civilians in Idlib.
As you know, we have there has been identification of different kinds of equipment and different nationalities of mercenaries by different countries that are reported. No, I mean, we are not verifying each of the equipments, but what has been clearly said by the media is that we have equipments, namely drones, which provide from the United Arab Emirates, that there has been movement through Egypt, that we have Turkish troops that, by the way, were confirmed by Turkey, and that there are mercenaries from Sudan, and that there was also elements of a Russian private company operating in the country. So these are the things that are. We have not a mechanism of verification. These are the things that are reported, and we have asked the Sanctions Committee to be very active in relation to it.
And on Idlib?
Sorry?
On Idlib, who is responsible for the bombing of Idlib?
No, on Idlib we have, this is public, no? We have operations that are being conducted by the Syrian government with the support of the Russian aviation, as we have attacks by the groups, the different groups that exist in Idlib. Some of them groups that are not considered terrorists, that are armed groups against the government, others that are terrorist organizations that are also attacking and bombing and causing civilian casualties.
Ibtisam?
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from the daily Arabic newspaper, Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have a follow-up on Sherwin's question regarding the Middle East plan and the announcement. Which message do you have to the Americans that they announce a plan without including the people who are under occupation? And my question is regarding critique from different people, including, for example, the Director of Human Rights Watch, who said in an interview to Al Arabi Al Jadid, to my newspaper, we had high hopes on selection of António Guterres as the Secretary General. Today he represents a disappointment. He is not prepared to speak frankly when influential countries commit human rights violations. He uses general and empty terms that do not highlight persecution nor puts pressure on countries that practice it. As thought, nothing has happened. He conducts diplomacy behind closed doors, but we have not seen any fruitful results. So what's your comment on this? Thank you.
Well, I obviously disagree with that observation. I think that we have done a big effort in close cooperation with the Human Rights High Commissioner to address many of the human rights problems that exist in the world. And obviously, we need at the same time to be able to engage with countries in order to avoid the dramatic outcomes of conflict and the dramatic outcomes of different forms of disturbance of peace globally. So we need to combine the two things. I think we have combined the two things. I have been fully supporting the Human Rights High Commissioner. There is sometimes a specialization of function. I think my role is essentially to define the principles and to define what needs to be done. Her role is more to look into the concrete situations. But at the same time, in many circumstances, I myself have intervened when it is justified. And obviously, we are not an NGO. We are an organization whose objective is to address simultaneously the problems of peace and security, human rights and development, and to make sure that we have, in this regard, the most effective capacity to serve and to benefit the people we care for.
And your message, follow-up to Sherwin, your message to the Americans for not including
we have said very clearly, that there are a number of resolutions, there are a number of principles, there are a number of aspects of international law that are not contemplated.
Majid?
Thank you. Majid Ghali, Rudaw Media Network. Secretary General, I have a follow-up about Iraq. The situation is not just a crisis of governance. The country is going through a crisis worse than that we saw back in 2014, which led to the catastrophic rise of ISIS with global implications. Protesters are getting shot and murdered by militias that the government itself says we cannot control them. Iraq went from partially being ruled by ISIS to be ruled by these militias. Question of many protesters that asking is why the international community is not doing enough to stop this bloodshed. And what is your message to the Iraqi leadership and those countries who influence them, namely Iran and the United States? Thank you.
Now, our message is very clear. I mean, it's important to preserve the unity of Iraq. It's important to preserve the independence of Iraq. It's important to preserve the conditions to allow for Iraq to establish normal functioning of a state. And one of the conditions of a normal function of a state is the monopoly of the use of force by the state, by the army and the police that belong to the state. What we have now in Iraq is, unfortunately, a number of militias that sometimes are the worst perpetrators of violations of human rights, as far as we hear, and we are witness many of the attacks on demonstrators, on peaceful demonstrators in Iraq, were done exactly by militias, which demonstrates that a vital question for the establishment of Iraq as a normal country is that the monopoly of the use of force is established in relation to the army and the police of Iraq. On the other hand, it's essential to avoid the external interferences that make it even more difficult for the Iraqis to come together, knowing, as we know, that the divisions are deep and that the risks of the country imploding are high, and it's absolutely essential to avoid it. Because Iraq is in a geographic location and as a nature that makes it a very sensitive country. To preserve the stability of Iraq is crucial for the region, an implosion in Iraq would have devastating consequences for the region. And so Iraq remains for us a very important priority in our advocacy, in our diplomacy, and in the support to the country.
Maria, TASS.
Thank you. Maria Hrenova, TASS News Agency. Mr. Secretary General, I wanted to ask you how concerned are you that the heart of United Nations, this headquarter, is getting less, is becoming less accessible lately? And
The heart of the UN is getting less accessible. The what? That the UN
should I
headquarters is
speak
getting less
louder?
accessible.
Yeah. Sorry, I will repeat. That United Nations is now becoming less accessible by diplomats. And,
yes, okay.
That host country, United States, sometimes is choosing who they want to see in United Nations or who they don't want to see, and for some countries like Russia, like Iran, other countries, it's creating problems. Which actions do you take to help it?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm very concerned and very active together with our Office of Legal Affairs and the General Assembly Commission that is in charge of the relations with the host country and who's presided by the permanent representative of Cyprus that has a very important action also in this regard. It is absolutely essential to have normality in the attribution of visas. Of course, there are situations that might justify, for matters of national security, any restriction. That is understandable in any country of the world. But that is what we are witnessing is, of course, something that needs to be normalized. And we need to have normal conditions for functioning of the United Nations, which means that visas need to be attributed in a regular way.
Pam Falk.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question is about coronavirus. Since the time the World Health Organization has determined the public health emergency, the virus has spread dramatically. Do you think the UN and UN agencies are doing enough? What would you like the UN to do? Has China responded appropriately? Some have been critical of the response of China itself. And would you recommend that Dr. Tedros or someone from World Health Organization address the Security Council as others have done in other health emergencies? Thank you.
Recommend that?
That Tedros or someone come to the Security Council as Ebola was taken up by the Security Council in the past.
So, as it is evident, this has been an epidemic situation that has been growing in an extremely meaningful way. I believe that China has mobilized enormous resources and enormous capacity to respond, and we have, of course, full recognition of that effort. But the dimension of the crisis is such that all efforts are sometimes insufficient, and China itself was the first to recognize that there were some difficulties and the name that they used, shortcomings in the response. I think the World Health Organization has been very active, trying to support China and to support other countries where cases have been developed. There is a panel of experts, as you know, that is supposed to decide whether or not at a certain moment it is a global emergency. They decided at the right moment. And we have been with other agencies, for instance, the International Organization of Migration is at the disposal of countries in relation to the problems of movement of people in these circumstances. UNICEF has also been very active. So, I mean, if you ask me, are we doing everything we should? Probably not. I mean, we are trying to mobilize our best capacities and best resources, but obviously this is something with a dimension and a concern that is sometimes difficult to fully respond. I have one concern. In this situation, sometimes it's easy to move into I would say perspectives in which there tends to be discrimination, there tends to be violation of human rights, there tends to be stigma on innocent people just because of their ethnicity or whatever. I think it's very important to avoid these. On the other hand, we have been working also hard in order to protect our own staff. There is no case until now of any staff member involved, but we have been introducing some strong recommendations. First, to limit travel to what is absolutely needed in the areas that are concerned. And second, when people travel in those circumstances and come back, to submit themselves voluntarily, and they have fully corresponded to a system of isolation, self-isolation for the period that is considered the relevant period. So, I mean, we have been very active, trying to do everything we can, also to protect our staff and to, without undermining our role and our work that needs to be done. But my appeal is, of course, for a strong feeling of international solidarity, a strong feeling of support to China in these difficult circumstances, but all to all the countries that might be impacted, and a strong concern to avoid the stigmatization of people that are innocent and that might be victims of that situation.
And is it suggested to Tedros or someone?
I mean, that depends on the Security Council. I mean, Tedros is at the entire disposal of the Security Council. The Ebola was a different situation because in Ebola you have a security problem in the same area. This is an epidemic. It's not usually the Security Council that deals with that, but Tedros will be entirely at the disposal of the Security Council, the General Assembly, or whatever UN body for whatever purpose that is considered necessary.
Sato-san, NHK.
Good morning, Secretary General. Fumitaka Sato from NHK. Two questions to you. One is this nuclear disarmament. Last year, one of the moral authority, Francisco Pope, visited Hiroshima. Do you have a will to visit Hiroshima in order to call for the action of the nuclear disarmament this year? And one other question is about a UN 75 global conversation. We've already did the 1-minute survey, and the 1 month passed from the 1-minute survey. So far, what kind of voice come from all over the world to you? Thank you.
Well, nuclear disarmament remains one of our key priorities. We have an agenda for disarmament, and we are very worried to see the risks of proliferation of nuclear weapons. We are very worried to see the fact that the medium-range missile treaty in relation to Europe has stopped. We are very much telling the US and the Russian Federation that it's essential to renew the New START and to have negotiations on that, because if the New START ends without renewal, it's not only the question of the limitation of arms, but it is all the mechanisms of control and monitoring that would be put into question. So this remains very high in our agenda. And I will be in Hiroshima for the 75th anniversary. And this will be also a way to demonstrate not only my solidarity with Hiroshima, but my strong commitment to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The
75th anniversary.
The 75th anniversary. I mean, it's too early to say what. I mean, you probably have witnessed, we have organized here in the plenary a big meeting with youth. I had already done the same myself in Davos. We are asking our resident coordinators to do it everywhere. We are suggesting governments, we are suggesting trade unions, NGOs, all organizations to engage in discussions of this nature through also we are doing through two important surveys. One is a simple survey that is widespread. The other is by a scientific team that will be conducting it worldwide. And I'm very grateful for all the countries that have been, we are not spending any UN money on this. It was all based on the donation of countries to this program. But it's early for the moment. we are starting the exercise. We will be presenting to the General Assembly a preliminary report in May, and then a final report for the session in September.
Sylviane?
Thank you, Secretary General. My name is Sylviane Zehil, Lorient Le Jour, Beirut. My question is on Lebanon. Je vais vous poser la question en français parce que je vais.
Well, I'll ask in French if that's not a problem. The revolution in Lebanon, which began on the 17th of October, is a protest movement against corruption and for deep change in the country. What happened is that we have seen a new monochrome government very close to Hezbollah coming in. And we know that Hezbollah has an arsenal, a stockpile, which has been condemned by UN resolutions, including 1559. Is this a topic of concern for you? Given this new peace plan issued recently by Trump, with the spectre of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, therefore, possibly coming in, as well as Syrian refugees into Lebanon. So there's a number of questions in one there. Well, you asked a number of questions, said the Secretary General. Yes, Lebanon is a key country, in my view, and its stability is crucial for the stability of the whole region. Lebanon also represents an experience of coexistence between various different religious communities, and this alone is an important contribution to today's world. Lebanon is certainly facing a complex political crisis, but with a very clear expression from many parts of the population that traditional government system in Lebanon no longer corresponds to what they want and hope for, and no longer corresponds to their concerns. This expression, these protests are continuing today in Lebanon, and we are following them closely. And this desire for an in-depth reform of the political mechanism in Lebanon, and the need to combat corruption and ensure that there is a Lebanese state which doesn't have a sectarian vision of its composition. We believe that's very important. But Lebanon is also facing an economic and financial crisis, which is a very serious one, and it's important to avoid that resulting in huge increases of poverty or instability in the country. Lebanon is making great efforts in terms of the refugees living in Lebanon as well. And it's important to preserve Lebanon's economic stability, to avoid these refugees paying an even higher price once again after everything they've already been through. So Lebanon is clearly a priority for us. We have two missions there, one linked to the south of the country and the relations between Lebanon and Israel. And I think there that we have played an important role in avoiding escalation. And I think it's crucial to avoid a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, and we will continue to work to that end. And we also have a special political representative who is following the situation directly, without interfering in Lebanese life, but who attempts to support any movements aiming at effective reform of Lebanese institutions.
Errol Avdevich, Web Publica Press. Mr. Secretary General, I would like to turn you a little bit on the less turbulent place of the world, although it was once very turbulent, on Balkans. As you know, this year there is going to be 25th anniversary of Srebrenica, also Dayton Peace Accord. And I would like to put that in the context of your initiative of the hate speech. What would be your message to the region in which hate speech still prevail and reconciliation is very slow, And what you are going to do, are you going to visit Srebrenica this year, to be there, and what else can you say about that?
Yes, I'm going. And I think it's very important to go to symbolically show exactly a very strong commitment to the need for Srebrenica never to be repeated, and the conditions that led to Srebrenica never to be repeated. We see with a lot of concern the evolution in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We believe that it is absolutely essential to move into a true reconciliation, and to fight hate speech is, as you know, one of our priorities. We also are in contact, of course, with the Bosnian authorities, with the neighboring countries, and from our perspective, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country that needs a lot of support of the international community in order to be able to overcome the fact that its dysfunctional political situation is remaining and is helping to fuel this kind of divisions that you mentioned. At the same time, we will be cooperating with all countries of the region, and I noticed that the High Representative of the European Union has been moved and said that this will be his first priority. And I believe it's important that the international community to be attentive and to be supportive to the countries of the region in order to allow them to address the divisions that still exist and allow them to move positively into the process of European integration, if that is the will of their peoples.
But what you have to say to those genocide deniers in Bosnia, for example, do you need that a new law would be essential to punish those like in Europe, you are coming from Europe, in order to prevent that?
It is absolutely clear that accountability in relation to genocide is essential. I mean, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was a special court that worked. I mean, in other situations, the International Criminal Court is active. In other countries, I mean, they don't accept that jurisdiction, and so we still are far from having a solid global legal penal system, but in my opinion it's very important to support it and to allow it to work as effectively as possible, exactly for crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide not to go unpunished.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.